everyone. My name is Ali Malik, and a big welcome to everyone this evening, and a particularly big welcome to Exeter, who are here. Very pleased to see you. It's my privilege to introduce the speaker this evening, Master Bruce Houlder. He's had a stellar career, and if I was to go through all his achievements, I would be here for too long. But he was called in '69, he was appointed a Queen's Counsel in 1994, and of course he's a bencher of this inn. He's the former chair of the Criminal Bar Association, he's a former member of the Criminal Committee of the Judicial Studies Board, he's an international legal trainer, and he was appointed the first director of the Service Prosecutioners of the Ministry of Defence. He was made a Companion of the Most Excellent Order of Bath in January 2013 for services to defence and especially service justice. He's a member of the Law and Criminology Advisory Panel for Sheffield Hallam University and an honorary doctor of the university. This evening he's going to be talking about a project, fighting knife crime. He's very kindly agreed to take questions at the end. So I pass you over to Master Houlder.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you, Master Treasurer, for that introduction. I didn't know you knew all that about me, but there we are. Last week, I had to go and speak to a group of very elderly retired businessmen, to whom I suspect knife crime was a modern phenomenon that needed explaining rather than something that was likely to affect them directly, except as a result of cutting up the meat that was in front of them. As with many of that generation, they had a rather more robust view of hardship than perhaps many of us have now. Most of them were well into their 80s. They were, in fact, very distinguished gentlemen, only gentlemen, I am afraid. That's the nature of that club, and I can hear the hisses. They were from a group called Probus. And as far as I can gather, that group was named after a famous and much garlanded general called Marcus Aurelius Probus, who, while things had gone well for most of his working life, died as a result of being cut to pieces with the knives and swords of his own men. And that was not the most obvious connection, but perhaps knife crime lay in the back of the minds of these elderly gentlemen as something they ought to take an interest in. Indeed, it would be fair to say that they were in the end far more interested than I expected. And I found that, like me, their own journeys had led quite a few of them in retirement to put back something that was missing from their busy lives before retirement in their work with communities, with local charities and with philanthropy. All of them were engaged in some way or another in that kind of work. And my message to you at the end of tonight will be that you, all of you, if you're not doing it already, need to do something now and not to wait, as perhaps I have, that long. I've no doubt at all that what led me to be doing what I am doing now was in part fashioned by all the years I spent at the criminal bar because of the sometimes clinical and rather detached nature of our work. Most of us gain the ability to throw off the tragedies that we encounter and just move on to the next case. Our encounters with harsh reality are always vicarious through encounters with accused men and women in cells, through speaking to the victims before they give evidence, to the bereaved, or just by listening to the evidence of those at the center of whatever human drama we happen to be engaged with on that day of the week. We sometimes have to coax evidence out through tears and to tease evidence from reluctant witnesses who are sorry that they ever spoke to the police, and even more sorry that they now have to recount their story in public. In 2008, I moved from the independent bar, as the Treasurer said, to becoming an employed barrister, and served nearly 6 years as the first Director of Service Prosecutions. And all my lawyers were officers of one of the three armed services. Many of them had been deployed in Iraq and Afghanistan, and most of them were bright, sensitive and intelligent people, many of whom had left some of the magic circle firms in the city where they worked as solicitors to do something better and to broaden their outlook and to give something back. And I had nothing but admiration for most of those officers, which it was my privilege during that time to lead. The Under-Treasurer, I know, will have some kind of idea of the ethos that possessed those young men and women. In 2008, I was just starting as the first civilian ever to command a military unit. Brigadier Harking was the commandant of the Royal School of Military Engineering. He will know better than I the kind of thing I'm talking about. But I remember myself, as part of my induction into the life and work of the services, being taken to Afghanistan and to Iraq and witnessing at first hand the work that REME did, the Royal Engineers did in Iraq and Afghanistan at first hand, rebuilding military vehicles that had perhaps just the night before been blown up by an IED, sometimes with fatal results for those aboard, and putting them back into service the following day, working day and night. Sometimes they were not so lucky, the people that have been inside, as I say. But when I'm talking about work like that, that should bring us all some humility about the lives that we are living and how we can ever match up. And as with service lawyers, if we have any sensitivity or imagination at all, then the kind of work many civilians do in crime can't leave us unaffected either. And as I stood away from the courtroom, stopped that kind of work, I realized that this was the case for me. The gladiatorial nature of the courtroom, at least in a criminal case, is quite capable of breeding a cynicism if you're not very careful. And in my case, I think it sometimes did. But what changed me most of all was what happened when I stopped. I looked back, really from the start of my time with the services, and reflected that that daily grind of the courtroom, preparing as we did in those days very often, case after case, back to back, sometimes even having to move from one court to the other to make a final speech in a case that hadn't quite finished before we had to start the next one. And it was a hard life, but a very rewarding one. But at the end, I felt somewhat chastened and began to feel some of the tragedies that I had witnessed over those years as I thought back over them, rather more keenly than I had expected. And my pathway, not unlike the original Probus, rather unlike the original Probus, was not to cut a swathe through my enemies at the head of one of Caesar's armies, but to wait, and not to wait till I was cut down by those I thought my friends, but to use the wonders of the internet and the more respectable parts of social media to assist and provide support for the armies of really good people who are out there working across Greater London to come together to defeat a common enemy. I'm not going to call it knife crime because the common enemy is much wider than that. But I had to give it a name, and that's how we formed www.fightingnifecrime.london. And if you come to look it up, remember the .london, not .com. Now, this website and its media resources is the means I chose to try to help those whose lives, or so it seemed to me, those whose lives need most help. They had been damaged during their teenage years, and they found themselves very often abandoned by the current educational system, perhaps excluded from school, placed in care, and then finding themselves all too inevitably very often in the criminal justice system. There'd be no safety net for many of these young people, no role models at home, and some of those had been abandoned by some of those who should be their role models at school, by a lack of investment in their young lives, not just in human terms, but in terms of the easily accessible facilities that decent societies should provide to young people to enable them to grow, to see that they have respect not only for themselves, but also for everyone else. Something had, it seemed to me, gone seriously wrong over the last 20 or so years in this country. And my concern was to be Greater London, because I can't take on the world in a moment. So about 2 years ago, I decided to do something about it as best I could. The immediate catalyst was a dinner with the chairman of the Tutu Foundation, who do a lot of work with young people, and the police, helping them to understand each other by conducting what are called Ubuntu round tables. Ubuntu is a South African method of mediation where, in an unthreatening environment, the two sides, as it were, are brought together and learn to understand and respect each other better. Also at the dinner was an amazing man called Sir William Atkinson, a black teacher and educationalist who had dramatically turned around a particularly difficult and failing school. His Wikipedia entry I saw for the first time tonight says that he was the inspiration, and some of you won't know what I'm talking about, I'm sorry for that, of Lenny Henry's character in the 1999 BBC TV series Hope and Glory. Well, suffice it to say, that describes a great man. But the next day, after that encounter, I had more than a germ of a plan. I wrote it all out on paper and sent it to someone whose opinion I respect and meet enormously, Sir Kenneth Elisa, who is the head of a number of charitable organisations, a businessman and a social reformer. He's also the Lord Lieutenant for Greater London. I just wanted to check my sanity about what I was planning, and I thought he was the man to speak to, and he left me in no doubt that I was absolutely on the right track, because there was, he felt, nothing like it in London at the moment. Well, to check that out, I then wrote to Sophie Linden, who was the Deputy Mayor for Crime and Policing in London, and asked whether she could provide her database of organisations working with disaffected youth and young people right across London. I would have thought that was a fairly simple request. I wanted to build my own database for my website, and I thought she would help. And she wrote back to say, not much more than the fact that they didn't have such a thing. Well, whether that was true or not, they now have. In June of this year, after some 18 months or so of preparation, and now 5 months ago, we launched the website, reached out over Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn, and using contacts that I'd made when, over 20 years, I was chairman of the Bar's Public Affairs Group, some of the press contacts I had, we reached out to the press and broadcast media. It gave us a very good start. On the first day, I don't know whether they were nervous, I got invited to Downing Street to explain what I was trying to do. I'm not to this day quite sure why I got asked, but I was. So I thought, well, we're onto something here, and got going. And the website now is a vast area which has now been shortlisted for the Criminal Justice Alliance Digital Media Awards, which we hope is going to announce the winner in 2 weeks' time, and we're hoping for that. But we're far more than a directory. It's an easily accessible source of information about hundreds of charities, third sector organisations, groups and projects working in Greater London, with direct links, one click, straight through to their own websites. But it's also an academic resource that brings together all the many reports about knife crime and youth violence and youth alienation that are produced by a vast range of organisations, charities, foundations, governmental organisations, and so on, putting them all in one place so they're easily accessible. We run a regular online magazine where we get all sorts of people to write about their experiences and the work they're doing and discuss improvements to the situation. We have a news area where people can post events that are coming up that are relevant, videos and articles of interest to those working in this area. It's intended to be a one-stop shop for information, a place to advertise relevant projects and events, and to discuss solutions to the multiple problems that now overwhelm some less fortunate lives than are here in this hall. It's well on the way now to being precisely that, because it's all about collaboration, all about working together with our principal partners to find solutions and to direct the debate about youth violence, youth alienation to a better place than where it is now. And in preparing all this, I had to trawl through hundreds of websites, I had to read endless reports, and I discovered much that was wrong and learnt much about how we might do better. The works led me into contact with some amazing people who've been spending all their lives doing this kind of thing. And I was trying to get them to work with other organizations that needed their kind of experience to help them grow with the work that they were doing. One thing you very quickly learn is that we don't have so much a problem with knife crime, although there have been far too many young people dying in this way, as we have a problem with getting really serious about the means we deploy to bring it to an end. There are lots of trite phrases that go around. First, it's rightly said that there's no one answer, that the solutions are to be found amongst communities who know and understand the problems of that community. All that, of course, is true, as far as it goes. And it's also said by some that nobody could possibly understand or know how to help unless they themselves had walked the walk and been directly affected by knife crime. Well, I don't buy that, and I could give you quite a few reasons why not. If you can't deal with things unless you've experienced it, then perhaps it's only because you lack imagination, and I'm sure nobody here has that lack of imagination. I think as lawyers, we are required to have it if we are to act for others at the most critical time, very often, of their lives. There's great work done in those communities, in sports, for example, football, martial arts, boxing, rowing, swimming, whatever it happens to be, all forms of sporting activity where youth are engaged. The premierships, clubs work together to try to draw young people from the poorer communities of London and engage them in sporting activity. The arts, there's theatre, performance, performing arts generally, making music, being part of a band, singing. These things have got real relevance to many young people and have got a huge ability to inspire and to change lives through the transformative power of music and making music together. There are the traditional established uniform groups, Sea Cadets, Police Cadets, Army, Navy, Air Force Cadets, working across London. And I know how those organizations can help and give great strength of character to the young people that are doing that. They might be said to be the people that are saved. They are the people who found a solution. But it's all the people that haven't that are my concern. Another important area of help that is, I think, vital across London are the number of organizations that are involved in mentoring young people. One group I particularly like is a group called Local Village Network, founded about 15 years ago by a woman called Rachel Box, who have hundreds of people on their books, and each one of those has an individual who has volunteered, assigned to them to give what is called the power of an hour of their time, advice and help into employment, whatever it happens to be, to that young person. And that does real work for those young people, some of them in quite desperate circumstances, helping them with their mental health difficulties, bullying problems they have. perhaps trying to be dragged into a gang, employment, training opportunities. The lists are endless, and there's an app that supports that work. Those are the things that I want to encourage and support. All these are essential face-to-face community-based activities. The Mayor of London and his Violence Reduction Unit, who partner with us, rightly laud these groups and provide them with money to support whatever they do. There's some reports this year have come out saying that they don't do enough, what they do is inadequate. I don't want to get into those criticisms, frankly, because it's rather like sitting on the shore trying to find fault with a sailor who's battling with a storm at sea. But this really brings me to the root of the problem, which, unless it's tackled, will lead to greater and greater disillusionment and alienation of our young people, and in the end could lead to a significant breakdown of law and public safety. I know immediately I say something like that, I'm entering something, an arena that's acutely political. The tragedy is that it's become so. To demonstrate what I mean by that, I mean by political, a piece of research was done in 2018 to tweets where the exact phrase knife crime was contained. Of the 5,983 tweets in March of 2019, 43% of them, I beg your pardon, were about Sadiq Khan, the Mayor of London. 90% of those tweets were negative and or alternatively were racist or amounted to a hate crime. Knife crime was becoming a political issue. There also seems to be political capital, unfortunately, these days in seeking to cast blame on those with limited power to make change and who lack the power that governments and Parliament should have. Sadly for governments, it's too much talk about being tough on crime and far too little action on the root causes of crime. If you take a timeline from the murder of Stephen Lawrence until last year, what you will see is a ramping up of police operations, a constant return to and then perhaps a withdrawal from stop and search procedures, an increased focus in Parliament on legislating to create new offences involving knife crime and violent disorder, a new series of orders to deal with such offending, a move to criminalising, if you like, more of our young, and to ramping up the sentences for young people for such offending. From 2001, specific offences involving knives came to be separately listed for the first time in the crime stats. And that induced in the press a kind of moral panic, which, again, in the hands of political populists, demanded more and more heavy sentencing and lacked completely a more nuanced explanation of whatever the facts might reveal. In 2007 and 2008, a kind of war was declared on knife offenders, first in the press and then by our lawmakers. The Court of Appeal decided to increase the level of sentencing. And if you follow the timeline through, there are so many initiatives and turns in the road in terms of policy, offending, stop and search, the level of public attention, that statistics eventually become rather meaningless. If you ban zombie knives because pictures in the press have created a market for them that wasn't there before those pictures appeared, you immediately create a new statistic. If the Serious Crime Agency budgets are markedly increased during the time and more officers are seconded to them, more stop and search takes place. Crime stats go up again for that reason. And so does the moral panic that naturally accompanies it. And I'm not a little concerned, too, about the commodification of knives for profit. There's a thing called the Knife Angel. Some of you may have seen it. It's been touring the country. It's a a knife sculpture made out of 100,000 knives, 27 feet tall. It's really rather beautiful. Those who made it have given it the name the National Monument Against Violence and Aggression. The knives were seized as a result of knives handed into amnesty bins and also provided to them by the police still in their evidence tubes, and some of them still with bodily fluids on them. How bad is that? But they were cleaned up, and this knife angel was the result, to highlight knife crime in the United Kingdom and to educate young people of the harmful effect violent behaviour can have. Well, I'm not really sure what good that does as you stand in awe in front of this, as I say, rather awesome and beautiful sculpture. I'm not convinced. Why is it done? Does it ultimately make money for the artist? Because that same artist made quite a lot of money from making a gorilla out of spoons. Cutlery he moved on, different form of cutlery he moved on to. Does that attract more people to the places where it's displayed, bring more money into the local authority, the church body, or the museum that agrees to show it? What's it really about? And more than one person has questioned that. Some academics who've made a serious study of these things, and I'm thinking of two, Dr. Elaine Williams and Dr. Peter Squires, respectively from Greenwich and Sussex, have just co-authored a book on the subject called Rethinking Knife Crime. And it tries to trace the roots of contemporary knife crime epidemic. They also propose newer and alternative strategies to respond to that problem. They argue that the glorification and commodification of knife crime is now doing more harm than good, and that while knife amnesties are always helpful because they do gather together knives, it's not actually changing the statistics, because those who want to hand in knives or not use them anymore will get rid of them, and those that don't won't, and those that want to take it up again will just go to the kitchen drawer. So that's not ultimately an answer. Images of the seizures that police make have been used for about 15 years by the police. Gruesome, horrific knives, all laid out for display on the national press and on television. There's now very clear evidence that that is absolutely counterproductive in trying to prevent people possessing such things. They want to possess them because they've seen what they look like, and they want a bit of that. This amounts to a knife crime industry. Crime posters, T-shirts, stickers, magnets are being produced, educational packs, teaching resources, so much more. One of the most egregious ones that I have seen is in fact a human figure, actually black, with a knife through its head, a knife through its chest, a knife in each arm, a knife through both thighs. It's a knife holder, on sale for everyone to buy. What a dreadful thing to put on sale. That's the commodification. So if the Home Secretary gives more power to the National Crime Agency, to the police, and perhaps even now to civilian vigilantes, does it actually turn the tide, or does it make things worse? That's not an entirely facetious question. What it doesn't do is turn the tide backwards. I repeat, young people fear their peers far more than they fear the police. And we can see why when we read our newspapers. The number of teenage homicides in London has reached 26 this year. The highest ever was in 2008, when there were 29 killings. So we're not far off that figure. Solutions to knife crime ultimately are not helped by the sort of clampdowns we are seeing. If you seize those at the head of the gang and deal with them, of course that's good. But that vacuum will be very quickly filled, and evidence shows that it is. And it doesn't, in the end, reduce the level of knife crime. although at the moment we've got plenty of jobs available for young people, I'm told, they're not actually available for everyone. And the people we're talking about here tonight are not the ones who are likely to pick up those jobs. There has been, and will continue to be for a while, I think, a real problem with generational unemployment. Deindustrialization, which started not long after I came to the bar in 1969, has fed what sometimes called youth deviance. Young men in particular found that there was no formal work that they could mature into. Many of the brighter ones among that demographic have been attracted by the entrepreneurial logic of making money in informal, often violent and risky ways, selling drugs, creating high-value illegal markets where vulnerable, impressionable minds are used as employees, sometimes as young as 8. They're easily brought into a gang by fear and the hope of an income for themselves, a real income, and for perhaps members of their family that they care for. If you don't really fear the police because you fear someone far more dangerous than that, you're going to get what we've got now in London. It needs enormous courage and strength of character sometimes to extract yourself from that. Now, all of that's really pretty disturbing, but it's not my real message. You might like to know that things aren't quite as bad as you might read in the press. Knife crime statistics, and I checked this out with Dr. Elaine Williams at Greenwich University, because I didn't quite believe it when I read it. But knife crime stats from the Ministry of Justice September last year show a graph of offending involving knives and offensive weapons of one sort or another between 2009 and 2019. They first show it for offenders aged between 10 and 17, and then they compare that with the same offences committed over the whole age range of the population. The range for all offenders shows a reduction over that 10-year period from 30,000 offences per annum to around about 26,000 in 2009. I beg your pardon. 30,000 in 2009 and 26,000 in 2019. For the younger group, 10 to 17, the change is actually not dramatic at all. It falls just short of where it was in 2009 for those kinds of violent offending involving knives and offensive weapons. Who would have actually believed that, given what we read? Of course, more people are dying. More people are prepared to use extreme violence far beyond just carrying a knife. I remember I carried a penknife when I was young, and no one ever thought of using it. A lot of us did, but they're banned now. There's been a lot of money, too, spent by the government on PR, and we should question its effectiveness. An example was what the government did with what they called a hashtag knife-free campaign. They spent on that PR campaign more than the entire budget allocated in the particular period that it covered in 2018, more than the entire period of the budget allocated charities in that period who were trying to do work in the communities. The commitment of money by that campaign was spent on advertising, talking about real-life testimonies from young people and images of young people featured on Snapchat and Twitter and so on, and on-demand TV. None of it was information that wasn't being put about anyway on social media by those organizations who were doing the work on the ground. It's populist, it's true, but does it really help? This is the same government that has tried, and I'm not trying to attack the government, it's just that we've had the same government for the last few years, that decides to increase stop and search, which in many ways is counterproductive because it damages the attempts being made in many places to bring people alongside in ways that helps them to work with the police to respect them. It criminalises, too, young people who wouldn't normally have been caught, but only carrying a knife because they're fearful of the consequences of not doing so. In other areas, we're beginning to see, aren't we, these young people who carry knives in those circumstances more as victims than perpetrators. And perhaps that's the way we should be looking at it. Most of these offences are offences of simple possession. In our brave new world, though, tasers are rolled out, knife crime prevention orders are brought in, serious violence reduction orders are started, and a lot of these things begin with stop and search. That's how these young people find themselves not protected as they should be, but criminalised, and the press goes mad and moral panic takes over. The evidence from Scotland, though, is different, and it has a lesson or two for us. In a moment, I'm just, towards the end of what I have to say, going to mention the the public health approach to combating knife crime. It's something I'm due to discuss with the National Health Leads in London in a week or two. Governments in recent years have not done well. Spending on youth services in England was slashed by 73% between 2010 and 11 and last year, and by 38% in Wales, according to the YMCA, who provides these figures. During that same period, some 760 youth clubs were closed, 4,500 youth workers' jobs were lost. In Scotland, although they did also cut youth services by 11 million, their approach has something to commend it, because they are inclined to consider many of their young people as having as victims that have been created as victims by those who have lured them into their web. Scotland's Violence Reduction Unit was set up to stem the tide of knife crime, which saw Glasgow become Europe's murder capital. From 2005, the Scottish Violence Reduction Unit has proposed an entirely different approach to the problem. Its key message being that gang stabbings and slashings were not just a policing issue, but a public health issue. The unit's motto was a simple one: violence is preventable, not inevitable. And that seems to me a much more positive approach. Inequalities, whatever they may be, race, class, gender, poverty or deprivation, old communities that historically have become used to deprivation and violence, areas with high levels of delinquent peer groups who exhibit high levels of domestic violence are all risk factors which can be addressed in ways other, I would suggest, than arrest, prosecution and imprisonment. And they are really worth exploring. The root causes of crime and a solution to them is absolutely essential. We imprison far more people now than any other country in Europe. My message is that youth crime must be lifted out of politics. No one should disagree with that. We need to do everything we can to lift up our young people, give them hope. Knife crime, labels like that do detract from the concentration of our resources that should go on making our country just straightforwardly a nicer, kinder, greener and more recreational place to live, where the young are included rather than marginalised and abandoned with nowhere to go, nowhere to find where they can be respected because of what is provided for them, the facilities, the kind of places, not old disused church halls or broken down buildings, but places where they want to be, where they like meeting people, where they have the opportunity to meet employers, where they can get help for the problems that they have, and goodness knows so many of them have those problems now, when they can learn to understand that society has done something for them. They've given them a place to go where they can meet and recreate together. They can learn something new and find a way out of these problems that they face. There's much more activity now, and this is quite hopeful, among big corporations and local businesses as well. Social value is something they look towards. Many businesses now have what's called an ESG report, environmental, social, and governmental report, which basically looks about how they can make a contribution, not only on sustainability, but in other ways to help the communities in which they live. We're not going to get much help from government in terms of money. They haven't got any. And so we really need to look to individuals, everyone here, to corporations, to those you meet, to find ways to provide the places that I'm talking about, that young people can learn and grow and be protected. And as I say, to respect these things. These kinds of changes are like building cathedrals. They require faith, they require a sense of decency, a sense of character, energy, and a sense of duty that goes beyond the reach of barren imaginations. They require real leaders who count not the cost of the short term and invest in the long term, invest in the next generation, in all that they do and plan. Short-termism, that's the way of things now, is not going to solve anything. Throwing money at a basketball team is not going to make the grade if you don't tidy up the streets around the yard where they play and make it a decent place to live. No government or prospective government seems to have a long-term and realizable plan for the kind of change which would make so many other problems, and not just youth violence, change for the better. How much money would be saved from policing, the health service, from the environment, and from the general satisfaction of the population if people thought long-term and helped the young, respected the young, and provide a life that they can look forward to and thank the people who gave it to them. That, unfortunately, is not the way it is. As lawyers, we all know what we should be doing. Try and do something like this. Try and do something in this field. You all have your own individual talents. You have the skills. I hope you have the time. I know you've got the empathy and the experience to give it. I'm too old for doing more than I'm doing now, but young people really have an enormous amount to offer each other, and certainly to those less fortunate than you all are. So if you're not doing it now, just give it a go, and thank you, members of Gray's Inn, very much for listening. Thank you. More than welcome to try and answer any questions you have. And any that come in online, if anyone's listening out there. It doesn't have to be a question. It can be a statement of your own, just as valuable. I'm going to come closer. Here. Yeah.
There we go. My question was around how you view the systems change that are talked at the end of your remarks, that it's not just about providing the basketball court, it's ensuring that it's in a safe environment that's well lit, that doesn't have rubbish on the streets and so on. So when you think about the provision for special educational needs in school, tackling the problem of school exclusions and the shocking statistics around children on free school meals and how they fall into the cracks of the education system. What more do you feel needs to be done to tackle those elements of a young person's life to prevent them getting into a gang?
Yes, well, I hasten to add, an educationalist, and I don't understand the reasoning that lies behind school exclusion. But there was a very interesting article that was written the other day in the Thunderer column of the Times by Sir Anthony Seldon, where he spoke of the terrible situation that has risen as a result of school exclusion and the way we approach success at examinations. And that schools look to their league tables, they look to the level of success in that proportion of the school that achieves so many the particular results that they're seeking. But the rest are regarded and spoken of as failed students. That is a terrible label, he says, to put upon anyone. So all I can say is the language has got to change, and we've got to realize what a big step it is to exclude someone or to talk about them in that way, and to have an ethos within the school that treats kids who, for no reason of their own, can't achieve in the way that others can. They need help. They're the ones that need most help. And the places they're sent, the special schools that they're sent, are certainly not the places that they should be. They're described sometimes as holding pens. I don't know what the answer is, but someone has got to rise to that challenge who understands these things and can provide the money to do it. And maybe the answer is that there's a place for big corporations, banks, and philanthropists to step up and to provide something which those young people will be able to learn and grow within. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Right.
I was very interested in your point about politicians not investing in the long-term plans that could resolve the issues facing the criminal justice system. And I have to say, I very much share the same opinion that there doesn't appear to be a long-term view of politicians. It very much seems to be a short-term grabbing of power to fix their next term in Parliament. What do you think could be done to change that attitude?
Well, I think the answer lies in all of us, in the voices of all of us, because after all, we are the ones that elect these politicians to Parliament. And they're not all like that. I mean, I had a meeting last week with Wes Streeting, Sarah Jones, MP for Croydon, who founded the all-parliamentary group on knife crime, and an MP from North Cardiff, Anna McMorrin, who is doing something rather similar to what I'm doing in Cardiff. She calls it the Cardiff Project. And so there are MPs who do understand the problem, but it's not just on knife crime. The whole issue of short-termism has to be addressed. It's part of our system, the cycle of every 4 years, they've got to get re-elected. What does the Daily Mail say that they used to do? We've got to get our voices in there. We've got to be heard there. And you can demonstrate if you want, as long as it's peaceful. But somehow or other, we've got to make the noise heard. Yeah.
Thank you. That was a wonderful talk. And for the last 10 years, I've worked in the third sector in Scotland. And one of the initiatives that has been taking place is the education of the police force and the third sector charities that are working alongside different groups and youths in what is known as ACEs, which is the adverse childhood experience that relates to
Yes.
different events in a child's childhood that will impact on their abilities to succeed as an adult. Do you feel that we in the legal education sector, in the legal sector, should be educated with regards to ACEs so that we can influence other people that we come into contact with on a regular basis as to how young people with ACEs should be treated?
Yes, I think so. I think it is necessary to do that. I know that, although I've said a certain bit about sentencing and prison sentences, the situation is very different to the way it was a few years ago in the way young people are sentenced. The number of people held in young offenders institution has markedly decreased, partly because of the guidelines that judges are required to take account of. And I think those guidelines take account of the sort of issues that you are speaking about, but I don't think any of us are judges or lawyers are particularly well educated about these things. We know that there's a problem and brains are changing and minds changing during their teenage years. But there's more that could be done to educate those at the back end of the criminal justice system who have to deal with the people that get washed up on the shore there. There is more that we should make it our business to know and understand. I agree with that. Yes.
Over here. Hi. Sorry. What impact, if any, do you think the mandatory minimum sentence for a second strike knife offence?
Sorry.
This mandatory minimum sentence.
Oh yes. Well,
for a knife or offensive weapon offence. What impact, if any, do you think that's had?
I don't know is the answer to that. I don't. If deterrence is your game, I don't think it's enough of a deterrent. But I'm not saying that that means the deterrent should be increased. I don't think the average foolish person who is convicted of knife possession and does it again really has in the back of his mind the consequences if he does so. I mean, he does it because he's a fool, and he does it because he doesn't think, and because nobody has shown him a better way. So I don't think these sentences really make that much of a difference. It's an answer to those that say, well, these people have got to be locked up. Of course they've got to be punished. I'm certainly not arguing against that. But if you ask me the question in that way, I can't see necessarily that there's any powerful evidence to show that it makes a great deal of difference. Yes. Yep. Hello. I'll take this last question. The caterers will be making faces at me if I don't.
Hi there, thank you for your talk. You spoke about how knife crime has been politicised. I'm just interested to know what your thoughts are on how one goes about depoliticising knife crime.
Well, I mean, London is where I'm doing this work, and it's a classic example of it. We have a Labour mayor in power. He's given the job of controlling youth violence in London. We have a Tory government and a Prime Minister who used to be Mayor of London. And unfortunately, the game that gets played is a political one. And that's why you get people blaming the mayor, when it's not actually necessarily the mayor that's caused the problem. It's the lack of solutions provided by the government and the previous government and the government before that to take our young people out of this marginalised state in which they now find themselves. So that's what I mean by politicalisation. And I mentioned the tweets about knife crime, most of them directed to a political end, to attack the Mayor of London, to make racial slurs about him, in some senses amounting to hate crime. And that's politicisation, isn't it? That's all I can say. All right, well, thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Just wanted to say thank you so much for that presentation. It was truly wonderful. Just 2 points to perhaps make. First of all, how important your project is. It really is. The issues that you've covered are so important, and we can't thank you enough for looking at those issues because they matter to all of us. And the only other point I would make is this, is that Bruce has shown what it is to have a stellar career at the bar and also to give something back, and he's giving it back big time. And I hope that all of you will have successful careers at the bar, but remember that we do have a duty where we can give something back, whether it's promoting the rule of law, whether it's promoting equality and diversity, or whether it's promoting access for justice. So if you could, please think about that, because it really does matter. But the main thing is to thank Master Houlder for the excellent presentation. Thank you.